Hello, good afternoon. There's more seats in the front if you stragglers back there want to fill in. My name is Katie Adams. I'm the chair of the board for the Exeter Literary Festival this year. Thank you for coming to our final event for 2025. We are absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Tiya Miles here. She's the author of 8 books, including 4 prize-winning histories about race and slavery in the American past. Her latest work is the biography Night Flyer, Harriet Tubman and the Faith Dreams of a Free People. Her 2021 National Book Award winner, All That She Carried, was a New York Times bestseller that won 11 historical and literary prizes. Her work has been supported by the MacArthur Foundation Genius Award, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Guggenheim Foundation. She was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and is currently a professor of history at Harvard University. She's going to be joined in conversation by Caleb Gayle, an award-winning journalist. His 2022 debut book was We Refuse to Forget, a true story of Black Creek's American identity and power. And he's a professor at Northeastern University. And he has a forthcoming book, I think this year, called Black Moses, A Saga of Ambition and the Fight for a Black State. So they're gonna talk, and both of their books are available for sale, and at the end of the event, they'll be available to sign. So please welcome Dr. Tiya Miles and Caleb Gayle.
Thank you for that, Katie. Hey, you all. I am very happy to actually be here in one piece. I'm glad Caleb made it too. We both are coming from the Cambridge area through a lot of heavy rain and a lot of traffic. And I have to admit that I expected to see about 5 people here. So my heart is warmed by the fact that you were willing to come out of your homes or to stay out if you've already been at the book festival today in this dreary weather to hear me and Caleb discuss Harriet Tubman and some other historical figures and the work of writing biography. So because Katie asked, I am going to start with a very brief reading, which I hope will enable you to feel the tone of my latest book, Night Flyer, which I had intended to be a different kind of biography of Harriet Tubman. Because we do have other biographies of her which are excellent and which are done by wonderful scholars who are also my colleagues, one of whom was actually my mentor. So trying to enter into the space of Harriet Tubman's world in a way that could open new questions or show us new insights, was really quite a challenge. I attempted to step into that space by focusing on her spirituality and her relationship with the natural world. So I think of this biography as an eco-faith exploration of Harriet Tubman, and I consider her religion and also her keen attentiveness to the world around her, to her environment, and you can define that in many ways, as being key to what made her the person that she was, to what enabled her to accomplish the incredible things that she did. Is that better, you all? I thought I heard somebody whisper, Mike. Okay, great. So one of the ways that I attempted to write a biography that would occupy a different kind of space or have a different kind of feel that would enable us to see Tubman, I drew on poetry, and I also tried to write a little bit of verse myself. And these examples appear at the front of the book and also at the end of the book. So I'm going to start by reading you a little snippet from an Instagram, which is called Black Liturgies. And this Instagram is written by Cole Arthur Riley. It's quite beautiful. Maybe some of you have encountered it before. She is thinking about Black Christian faith and writing beautiful verses on her Instagram. And this is what I borrowed from her and what I've used to open Night Flyer. Let us grasp the staffs of our past, believing in their power even now, that we would be a people who meet desperation and sorrow with a remembrance that protects us from despair. When I read those lines, I just absolutely loved them for the way in which Cole was thinking about the past, people, places, events that are behind us as almost physical things that we can grab like a staff to anchor us in the present. And I appreciated how she was recognizing in these lines that many of us are feeling desperation and despair and sorrow in this moment, and that remembering the past, grabbing onto those staffs that are available to us can help us to navigate through. So perhaps inspired by Cole, but also inspired by a saying of Harriet Tubman's, I wrote these next lines. Please remember, you're not looking at a poet. So be gentle with me. Ours is the time of the seventh trouble, but we do not wait in these woods alone. Harriet walked this way before, showing us how the wilderness works. She could have leaned against that tree. She would have pointed out that star. She could have sketched a map in the dirt and bid us to memorize it. Then she might have whispered a secret that the trees already knew. We can be a flock alighting. If we join hands, we will fly. So, the inspiration behind those lines is at least twofold, probably more. One is, when I was reading primary sources about Harriet Tubman, I kept seeing references to her being in dire straits and beginning to pray and saying, the Lord was here and helped me through 6 troubles. He's not going to let me down in the 7th. The Lord has been here through 6 troubles. He's going to be here on the 7th. So she was really focused on this notion of the 7th trouble, the trouble that is around us right now. And she had faith that the God of her belief would appear to help her and the people that she was aiding in those times. I was also thinking quite a lot in this passage about Harriet Tubman's relationship with the wilderness and how she learned to navigate the out-of-doors in many ways through different phases of her childhood. Among her greatest skills, as you all I'm sure already know, was her ability to read the sky. She talked about how she was always sure of where the North Star was, of where Polaris was, and that's how she could find her way north. She had many other environmentally conscious, environmentally aware skills that she put toward her grand mission of freeing herself, her family, and many other people from captivity. And I think maybe Caleb and I will go into that a little bit in our conversation. So I'm gonna stop there, and thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to talking with Caleb and with you.
Good afternoon. So I always have to kind of level set with audiences, especially here in New England, that I didn't grow up anywhere near here. I grew up the son and grandson and great-grandson of pastors, and not just pastors, but black pastors in black churches. So I have this tendency of kind of assuming that when I say good afternoon, it would come roaring back at me, which I understand is not necessarily reflective of the New England experience. We're going to try it one more time. Good afternoon. It's wonderful. See, I didn't even make you say hallelujah or amen or anything like that. It's such a pleasure to be here for me, in part because I'm a bit of a Dr. Miles fan, so much so that she's had to tell me on several occasions to not call her Dr. Miles, but to call her Tiya.
And yet,
Listen to you. It's going to happen. It almost feels irreverent to do so. But I kind of wanted to start our conversation a little bit, maybe a bit geeky, focused on kind of the craft and what you kind of set out to do. There's a line in your book very early on where you said, before I started on this quest to trace the lifeline of Harriet Tubman, I too had fallen for the static image of Tubman as Superwoman. Her bravery, though laudable, seemed to come prepackaged in a box of stock stories and folksy sayings. And I realize now, and with chagrin, that she had become the stock figure in my imagination. And it seemed like for someone who has been written about so much, mythologized so much, you came to a genre of writing that is different and new for you, or newer for you, which is biography. And so I'm just curious how you, given kind of the large trove of works that you have, what convinced you that the biography told in this way was the way you wanted to approach the story about someone so, in big air quotes, well known?
Wow, Caleb. You came out of the box with a very deep and complex question. I love talking about craft, and I'm glad you asked that. I want to begin by saying there are multiple origin stories for any project, and this one certainly had various beginnings. I had an ulterior motive when picking up this project. That motive had to change, which I will explain in a moment, but I did have a sense of direction before I began it. And that sense of direction was, I will admit, social, political, and cultural. So I can feel a bit of discomfort here because I'm a scholar, you're a scholar, we know we need to ask tough questions, we know we need to get to the sources and make our best cases, make our best arguments based on what it is that we find. And at the same time, I have always hoped that the things that I researched and wrote could maybe contribute to our society in a way that would help us to recognize and begin to, together, build solutions for our shared problems. It's always been something in the back of my mind as relates to my work. Many years ago, around 2005, I think it was, maybe it was 2008, I think I say it in the book. I had a colleague who is an environmental sociologist. Her name is Dorceta Taylor. She teaches at Yale University now. Back then, we both taught at the University of Michigan, and she knew that I was studying enslaved Black women. And one day after I gave a presentation, she came up to me and she said, you really should think about Harriet Tubman more, because Harriet Tubman was an environmentalist. I thought, that's interesting, that's surprising. I took it quite seriously though, coming from Dorceta Taylor, whose work in environmental studies I had admired quite a lot. And so at that time, many years ago, I started paying attention to Harriet Tubman, collecting information about her. I did a teaching video about her life. I started looking at other materials related to the question of enslaved women and environmental awareness and environmental consciousness. And when I turned to the primary sources having to do with Harriet Tubman's life, I did see the way in which the natural world was a major component, and even a character in her development. It was a source of information for her, even a source of empowerment for her as she carried out her life mission. When I recognized that my colleague's comment was true, that is, it could be borne out through the evidence, well, let me back up and say, maybe not that she was an environmentalist. that's a fairly specific statement, but that she was environmentally conscious, that she had a very strong environmental awareness. When I saw that, I thought that this might be the time to bring Harriet Tubman out so that we could see her life as related to our environmental crises today. My thinking about that was that Tubman is, or at least was, before recent months, a figure who was not particularly controversial in terms of people knew about her, and everybody kind of agreed she was important. Everybody kind of thought we should read about her, that it'd be okay to have her poster up, on the classroom wall in the elementary school, and so on. So I thought, if I can bring Tubman to the fore and show and demonstrate how important the environment was to her, that might be a way of talking about how important the environment is to us and how critically necessary it is for us to recognize that and to protect it. So that was the impetus behind the book. The biography was somewhat secondary. So choosing that form was somewhat secondary to the theme that I wanted to look at, which was Harriet Tubman and the environment, or Harriet Tubman and the natural world. The biography happened because I just got lucky and was invited to participate in this biography series that's been edited by Skip Gates. And when I was invited to do it, I said, hey, I've got the perfect person. Can I write about Tubman? And the editor said, yes. And I said, and can I write about the environment? And that response was maybe a little bit slower to come back to me. I think they were scratching their heads like, well, what is she talking about? But they said yes to what was perhaps an unusual way of entering into Tubman's life. I was very grateful for that. And the religious and spiritual aspect actually came later. I didn't know that was going to be such a big part of the book when I first proposed it.
That's incredibly interesting, and I think it makes me, I think what was really interesting about the angle of environmental engagement being such a useful kind of foregrounding element of the book was that it almost helped to make your point that, especially when it came to the religious and spiritual aspect, that despite there being almost this mystical yet intimate relationship that Tubman perceived herself having with God, that the environmental component made it tactile and embodied. And so I'm curious if you can kind of help us explore that, right? How, to some extent, the environmental component made Tubman's faith even more realistic, or even for those who might not be of any sort of religious persuasion or didn't grow up like me in pews every Sunday, all day. How to some extent her experiences and engagement with the environment kind of brought a certain closeness and intimacy, but also a full embodiment and tactile nature of experiencing her spirituality. Like, can you give us some insight into that?
You are absolutely right that her environment grounded her, and that by looking at the environment as a theme, I was able to come a little bit closer to her as someone seeking to interpret her and to narrate her life with and for other people. We all do live in a natural world. It's easy to forget that, but everything around us somehow came from the earth. And that aspect of our lives is a connector, I think, for us when we think about other people. Mm-hmm. So when I write about how Harriet Tubman was working outdoors, we can imagine ourselves working outdoors. We can imagine ourselves with our hands in the soil, although under very different kinds of circumstances. And those imaginings help bring her into clearer focus. So your question makes me think about the weather again today. I don't like to drive, you all, okay? And I had actually kind of convinced my husband that it would be really great fun for us to come up to New Hampshire today and bring our teen, and we're gonna have a day and go out for lunch, and it was a wonderful plan, but then he ended up going to a conference. And even my 16-year-old was like, I'm not gonna drive with you. He wanted to stay home too, so it was me in the car in the rain. The book opens with Harriet Tubman in a storm, seeking shelter beneath a tree. And I think we have all been there. It can be incredible how frightening a storm can be, I mean, we've been through storms, right? We know they happen. Some of us perhaps have been through very dramatic, horrible storms. But when it begins to rain or the wind begins to blow, I think sometimes that we imagine that, okay, this is normal. We can make it through this. But then something might shift and it becomes very dramatic when the wind is howling, the rain is pounding, and then we feel this kind of, this instinctual sense of like we are in trouble. But I think that's deeply embedded in us. It's a part of our animal nature. We're all animals as well as I think we are all, spiritual or soulful beings in addition to that. But we know when there's trouble. So Harriet Tubman in the storm, facing a deep kind of trouble at the beginning, became a way to show her as a real person who feels the way we might and who was at risk the way we would have been if we attempted the things that she did, but who nevertheless kept going out there into those woods, trip after trip after trip, because she believed it was the right thing to do. So this is part of a response to your question about how the environment helps us to see her and to kind of feel her and be with her in a more sensory way, kind of in a tactile way. I also want to speak to how the environment shaped her and how it ended up connecting with her spirituality. So Harriet Tubman was born around 1820. We're not actually completely sure of the date. Some scholars say 1825. For many enslaved people, we don't have that precise a record. And she was born in Maryland, near the Chesapeake Bay, to enslaved parents who were brought together or who came together because each of their owners married. So when Tubman's mother's owner married her father's owner, the couple was brought together in the same location, and they decided to marry as well, though it wasn't legal for her parents to marry. And they had Tubman and her 8 siblings. Her parents lived apart because they were being leased out all the time to different enslavers. These were temporary enslavers who were kind of renting them. And the children were also separated continually and serially when Tubman was growing up. When she was leased out, she was often put to work outdoors, doing grueling work that I can't even imagine. So as a very young child, when she was, around the age of our kindergartners now, Tubman was sent out to a family in which the man of the household, the last name was Cook, was catching muskrats. That was something that he did as part of his livelihood. And he would send her out, a small girl, not even that high, right? A small girl around the age 6, 5, to collect those dead bodies from the traps. This work was so dangerous, and she was so unprotected for it, meaning she didn't have shoes, she didn't have warm clothing, that she became deathly ill, at which point this man sent her back to her owner and said she was basically useless, worthless, and her mother nursed her back to health. This happened again and again in Harriet Tubman's young life, that she was leased out, rented out, sent away from her family, and she was doing work that was in the outdoors that enabled her to learn some things about inside versus outside. So outside was dangerous, outside was unhealthy, outside was grueling, she knew that. But outside also provided her with just a little bit more autonomy or a little more room to look around her, to consider what it was that she was observing, to think, to dream, to imagine, to push the spatial boundaries of where she was being enslaved. Versus indoors, she was always under the eye of the woman in the household that is, her mistress, as she would refer to these women. One woman that she would talk about, whose name was Miss Susan, that's what Tubman called her, rented Tubman, when Tubman was again very small, to take care of Miss Susan's infant. And Tubman's job was to make sure that the baby didn't cry. Now, any of us in this hall who has had a baby knows how impossible a task that is. Now imagine your own small child having to make sure that your infant baby never cried. That wasn't going to be at all possible for the young Harriet Tubman. But Miss Susan would sleep with the whip under her pillow, so that the second that she heard her baby crying over there, she would grab the whip and begin to physically abuse the small child Harriet Tubman, whose job it was to keep the baby quiet. So outdoors, indoors, all dangerous, but indoors, the danger was right there and ever present and ever constant. So Tubman began to prefer being outside, as dangerous as it could be, as sick as she could become. And she began to learn, even as a young child, that outside was a place where she could think and where she could pray. And this was a place where she kind of developed her own interpretation, maybe even an ideology, of the world around her. She, through prayer and through thought, when she could get little pieces of time away from her enslavers, came to understand that slavery was wrong. And she came to believe that God also thought slavery was wrong. She felt that God was on her side in this belief. And her prayer life and her spiritual sense began to fuse with her time outside. There was kind of an overlap between those spheres in her life that I tried to explain in the book. That overlap became even more powerful as she matured and as she became more skilled and more knowledgeable about the outdoors and as she grew in her own faith. So you mentioned not everybody has a religious conviction, not everybody is a Christian. This is certainly true. And so in trying to understand Tubman's experience of spirituality, in the book I try to refer to God, in her sense, as the God of her belief. We may not all believe that there's such a being as God. We may not attribute the kinds of powers to this being or entity that Tubman does. But it was very clear in the sources that Tubman believed this 100%. She believed that this God was there. She believed that she could kind of access or connect with this God, especially when she was in isolation. She prayed often in nature, and she began to think of the different features or qualities of nature as entities that were kind of reflections of God, or God's helpers in her life, or entities that had an animacy or an energy that she could tap into to achieve her own ends.
That's really powerful. And what's really difficult sometimes as a moderator is that you end up being like, yeah. And you forget, oh, I have a question on deck that I'm supposed to ask. But, just to stick with this, the potency of the theme of the environment, it almost seems like, there are like some questions I want to ask about how, like, to some extent the environment almost serves as archive, right? But this isn't your first time, right, treading in these waters about kind of writing about the ways in which the environment provides almost kind of a narrative and instructive tie for the reader to understand places and people. And I remember reading Wild Girls when it came out, and that book really kind of celebrates the outdoors as both a political and spiritual site for women. And I'm just so curious that we would then get to inherit kind of or experience Night Flyer, and it almost feels as if there's a sequential tie, perhaps, I don't know. But I'm just curious if writing Wild Girls influenced or changed or even nuanced your approach that you ended up taking, with Night Flyer.
Yep. Yep, it absolutely did. So Wild Girls, you all, is a slender little book that is about girls in the outdoors in the 1800s. Each chapter looks at a few different girls from a range of backgrounds and considers how spending time outside in her childhood ended up shaping her into someone who had a major impact on her society or culture. And this book, almost like Night Flyer, it came to me in an unexpected way. During the lockdown, that's not the term I want to use, during the isolation period of COVID. And this was a time when my family and I, living in Cambridge, were kind of pulling our hair out, in a sense, because we were all working at home online. Because I'm a professor, I teach, my husband, the same. We had 3 kids in the home who were all doing school from home. Yes. It was something else. Each of our kids kind of set up a room as their own little schoolhouse. So there was not even any house left by the time. We had one kid doing school in the dining room, one kid doing school in the living room, which was taken over. So we are fortunate that we have a yard. We're very lucky, especially given that there was a time when our neighborhood park, which is just a block away, was closed down. Did you all have that here? Yeah, okay. So the kids couldn't even go to the park to play. But we did have a yard, and that yard became such an incredible outlet for us. I mean, for our neighbors too. I remember I'm not telling anybody, but no names. But I remember our neighbors, we share a fence. There was one time when their teenagers who were about to graduate from high school, and who did graduate actually, one of the teenagers graduated during COVID, and they had a drive-by graduation with lots of honking and balloons. It was really creative. But I remember when that high school senior was in their backyard, we share a fence, right, just screaming her head off. It was quite something. But we needed that outlet. And those of us who had yards, who lived in neighborhoods with lots of trees, we could access it by going outside. It struck me then just how important outside is, especially to young people's mental health. I mean, I think that our sweet neighbor just needed to let it all out. And my kids are doing something similar. I mean, they weren't, I won't say this is gonna never happen, but they weren't outside, screaming at the top of their lungs, but they were spending a lot of time outdoors, doing things like watching the rabbits, looking for rabbits' nests, getting more interested in gardening. And we had that outlet, which was so critically important. So when I was invited by an editor for W.W. Norton to write a book in their series, which was going to be called The Norton Shorts, about an idea, it just came together. I want to write about girls outdoors in a time period that I have some familiarity with. And the first historical figure that came to mind for that book was, of course, Harriet Tubman. Because you all now know that I've been collecting information about her, for years. So I had the file. It was sort of sitting there and ready for me. And it was through going back to that material that I arrived at the thesis for the book. The argument that spending time outside really helps to open up these girls' imaginations, help them to think in different ways, help them to see themselves as people who could have agency, who could be active in their worlds. And once I had that thought about Tubman, I tested it out with some other figures, young people whose lives I had studied or had come across in my research or teaching, and the thesis was holding across these different young women, across these different girls. So this book just became a total pleasure to write. I mean, it was, even though it takes place in the 19th century, when a lot of quite unfortunate things happened, it was focusing on more of kind of a bright side or a light side of that period by thinking about what were the ways that people who were constrained by multiple societal factors, what were the ways that they were able to push past those limits? To me, that was just really inspiring, and the book was something that I ended up feeling like I hoped it could be a gift to a range of different kinds of readers. I kind of imagined that Wild Girls could be a book that somebody who was going to go off on a hike and wanted to, maybe take a break along the way and, have some nuts would pull out of their pack and read a chapter of. But Wild Girls was limited because the series was called the Norton Shorts, right? The books were supposed to be very short, and there was only so much that I could do and say, but thinking through those questions, looking at the material about Tubman again, showed me that there was so much more that I could do with her. So I think that when the chance came to write for this biography series, Wild Girls had primed me for thinking, more Harriet Tubman, I want to write 200 more pages, about her. And that's the connection.
To kind of return to Tubman and her engagement with the outdoors, but then also, I think the thing I've always been struck by and really kind of rang loud and clear to me when reading your book was that for as spiritually motivated and engaged, as environmentally engaged as she was also quite the strategic thinker and doer, right? And not, I think often we have a tendency, especially of a lot of historical figures whose identity might place them on the margins of society, we have a tendency of kind of placing a halo of saviorhood upon them, right? And I kind of want you to, if you can, kind of walk us through the ways in which she kind of appeared to you as very much the strategic thinker that you end up rendering on the page. And not just a strategic thinker, but a doer, right? Who often, in many cases, helped to illuminate different ways of engaging, not just with the natural world, but also with military systems, with pathways, with navigation, right? So if you can kind of give us a sense of this incredibly strategic thinker and doer that oftentimes does not get her due as that.
Well, when I started thinking about Tubman, I saw her first as a doer. I think that's how many of us think of her as, we have a picture of her moving through the swamps, right? Probably at night and being very active in her life as she attempted to help people who were attempting to free themselves to make that bid successful. What surprised me was learning that she was a very careful thinker as well. I had her in a certain category in my head, and I think that many of us do. We don't often consider Tubman as kind of a forerunner of Black women's theoretical understanding, for example. But I realized that she absolutely was when I learned how to find her thought, that is, when I learned how to see where we have evidence of her thought. I think part of the reason why we couldn't see it so well before is because Tubman didn't write her own life story. We tend to rely on and we tend to really like texts that were written by the person, and for good reason. We have more of a sense that there's going to be veracity there and a closeness to the person's life or to their thinking. If I write my own book, you get to come very close to my thought. But if somebody else tells you what I did, there's a greater distance there. So Tubman didn't write her story. She was never able to learn how to read and write, and that puts us at a great advantage in trying to understand her thinking. So when I said I had to learn where to look, I mean that I had to realize that she was thinking through her prayers She was thinking through the songs. She was thinking through her strategy. And we did have a record of many of those things because while somebody else wrote them down, Tubman did recount her prayers to people. She did pray in front of people. People heard her singing. She would tell people the songs that she had chosen to sing as means of communication with the people that she was trying to help escape. She talked a bit about her strategy, though not fully, because she still needed to keep it secret. And all of these different pieces or fragments of information put together are like a compendium of the ways in which she thought. Once that came to me, I realized that she was a keen social observer. She was always kind of looking around and taking in what she saw, making these really quick decisions because she had to, based on what she saw. Now, if you ask Tubman, she would say that God told her these things. Like God told her better to go that way than this way when she was on the Underground Railroad. And maybe God did, we weren't there and we don't know everything, right? But another way to think about this is that with all of her knowledge, her experience, with the keenness and sharpness of her mind, it was actually Tubman who, in a moment of extreme stress and risk, would say, not this way, but that way. And when she chose that way, that was the map in her head. That was her environmental understanding. That was her knowledge that, wait, there's a Quaker village in that direction. All these things coming together in her mind at once, lightning fast, boom, 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 is what made it possible for her to be so successful as a leader on the Underground Railroad, as an activist on the ground. I think that we often divorce kind of movement and action from thinking, but of course, thinking is a part of it, and thinking undergirds it.
So I don't want to take up too much time because I know that the audience is going to have questions aplenty. And so the last question I want to ask before we pivot to the audience is, one thing I've noticed is kind of a theme that runs through a lot of your work are how you engage with material culture, right? How there are almost these totems that open up worlds that we otherwise wouldn't know, right? As an example, with your wonderful work, All That She Carried, about this particular sack that told much more intriguing multi-generational stories. Or in the case here of Tubman, I'm certain, I don't want to give it away because I want people to buy and read this book dutifully. But if you can you talk a little bit more about how you saw Tubman's world through material culture as well? Mm-hmm.
This is another way that I was trying to make Tubman real. Because as you said at the beginning, and I think it was in the last question, that there is sort of a savior sense about Tubman, almost that she is magical and mystical herself and not a real person. I wanted to dispel that, because if we think of her as not being a real person, then we diminish her accomplishments. And we also can't imagine that one of us could be as brave, as courageous as she was. So I really wanted to make her life-size in a sense. And this came down to thinking about how she was a real person with a real body who could actually really be hurt, who really did have to eat, who really did need shoes, who really felt pain, who really needed people to care for her. And we get to all of those spaces of the real through material culture. And so in Night Flyer, I tried to concretize moments when we see Tubman interacting with all the various things around her, as well as the various people around her, because that's how we know that she was real. And we know she's real when she becomes so sick that she has to be sent home to her mother, and her mother is, with hands on her and probably with plant-based medicines, nursing her back to health. We know she's real when Tubman herself is serving as a nurse during the Civil War, and she knows how to select the plants that can help to treat the soldiers. We know she's real when we understand that she was a quilter. This is my favorite little detail about material culture in Night Flyer. But Harriet Tubman was a quilter. She quilted before she began her rescue missions. She quilted during her rescue missions, according to somebody who knew her and talked with her. Sometimes when she was on the trail with a group, a party attempting to escape, she would have a quilt that she was piecing. So they had times when they had to lay low and be still, but she kept busy. And she'd just be piecing on that quilt. I just loved that picture. And I love the speculation of what would happen with the quilt. Would she give it to someone? Would someone be covering up with it, during the next journey on the road? And relatedly, one of the most interesting details that I tried to highlight in Night Flyer, related to material culture, is that when Tubman first ran away herself, she needed help from people, as we all do. And she seemed to know that you sometimes need to have something that you can barter or exchange that's valuable to the other person. Again, smart, right? Savvy. And so the first time that she escaped alone, she came to the household of a white woman in the area, and she needed information. She needed to know, where's the next place I can go? And she offered this woman a quilt that she had made as a means of exchange, or maybe even as a token, as a gift for that information. And the woman told her where she could go. So a quilt becomes kind of a means of safe passage for Tubman. And the materiality of it, I think, helps us to see how she was having to make these decisions on the ground and how she did it in a real world as a real person, just like we are.
So I love that, and I have a million other questions I could ask, but I know we only have time for maybe a couple or a few, and Katie's gonna be around with the mic. I see a couple of hands up already, one all the way in the back. But just wait for Katie to get to you, and I'm sure Ty will be able to answer those accordingly.
Thank you so much. Dr. Miles, thank you. My name is Rhonda Lee. I'm visiting from North Carolina, and our mutual friend Michelle Lanier asked me to give you her love.
Oh, thank you so very much. Please give love back to her for me.
I will, thank you. So I'm so grateful for your work, and what I particularly love and admire about your work is the way, as Professor Gayle alluded, that you can bring together many different sources, including sources that other people knew of but did not use in the way you have, to give us insight into people's lives, including the lives of children, which are notoriously difficult to illuminate. And so I'm wondering about the role of imagination, because you're I don't mean imaginative versus scholarly, I mean imaginative and scholarly. Your work is brilliantly imaginative. And I wonder about your imaginative process as a writer, if you could tell us something. How do you listen to music? Do you sit and ponder the sources? Do you go for a walk? Do you have people you talk to? How do you let your imagination play?
I love that question, and I can tell through that question that you are a colleague or friend of Michelle Lanier, who is also incredibly imaginative and who is a poet and who in her public history work brings that sense of beauty and kind of levitation to everything she does. I think I'm going to say all the above to the list. Where did you go? You sat down and I can't. Oh yeah, okay. To the list that you gave me. Excuse me. I think that probably first and foremost, I'm the visual thinker. So the way my imaginative process begins is I see an image. I mean, I saw the image of Tubman in the storm, and then I knew that was how the book should open. It wasn't particularly directed by me or solicited by me. I think that's partly the gift of imagination, is that we take in all kinds of ideas, we do our reading in the sources, we have conversations, we hear other people's thoughts on things, we go to a museum exhibition, we take a walk, and then whatever that is, in our minds, in our spirits, in all of us, that pieces things together, just get started. And we might not even be aware that that's happening until all of a sudden, here's an idea. So I tend to think visually. I tend to have an image of something that I try to write toward. I tend to allow space for those ideas and to trust them, and to not fight with myself too much when something might seem at first to not fit the project that I'm working on. I enjoy conversations with colleagues and friends and running things past people. I find it very helpful and constructive to present my work and to have people tell me what they think and to ask me, to have questions or to push back on things that are not working or that are not convincing. And I write and revise and revise and revise again. I feel that revision is an important part of the creative process because each time you go back to what you started on, you get to see it again, you get to try it again. I'm having an image now in my mind of the waves on a shore, right? As those waves are in motion, they're making something new and they're kind of refining what's being created in the process. And that's what writing is like for me. I absolutely love it. I feel like it is such a gift to be able to do this work. And I guess if I would say one thing to all the other writers out there, it would be to allow yourself the room to imagine and to picture, and to dream, even if you don't know yet where it will fit. And even if you feel that your discipline or your field or your zone of endeavor might frown on that kind of imagining, because you can refine what it is that you're putting forward. You can create it, and then you can kind of shave the edges off. I mean, my book 3 books ago, Caleb mentioned it. It was called All That She Carried, and it's about a family of enslaved women who passed down a cotton sack over the generations. And as I drafted that book, I wrote some fictional scenes that nobody else ever saw. Not an editor, not even a friend. I just wrote those scenes because I needed to see what might have happened. And then when I wrote the book, it is entirely nonfiction, but I had created the space in my own mind to speculatively, by asking questions, draft in some sections that would not have appeared if I had not allowed myself to just purely imagine what could have happened. So I am fully in favor of embracing imagination in our academic work.
Hi, so first of all, I want to say nice kicks. Really enjoyed your shoes.
Thank you.
I'm Chandra Prescott-Weinstein. I'm a professor down the road at University of New Hampshire, and I guess I'll build on the question that you just got asked about craft. How did you deal with the problem of chronological time and making choices about where things lived within the book? And I'm thinking specifically of the opening anecdote, but also the place where you do draw the connection. I saw it with All That She Carried, where the textile comes in. There's a very specific placement of where that is in the narrative, of where you enunciate her as a quilter that doesn't come up earlier. So I'm wondering how you made those choices about where we would learn different pieces of information that belong across her timeline.
Okay, let me just say something. I love you all. This includes, all the way from Caleb, this whole space. Your questions are incredible.
Good job, guys.
Oh, man. And thanks for the compliment. I will say, these shoes were made by an independent craftswoman in Cambridge. Her name is Maureen Kira, though I know I'm mispronouncing the last name. She told me how to say it, and I'm not very good with pronouncing the last name. Kira. Her shop is on Huron Avenue in Cambridge, and she's a Black woman who designs a lot of shoes. They are so cool. They're colorful, they're creative, they're wild. I mean, these shoes, my kids told me that these shoes are a little wild, and they are for me, okay? There's lots of colors. But these are one of her calmest shoes. And there may be like 5 or 6 colors in these. This makes me think of a quilt. That's why I love it so much. So, chronology. Chronology is a tough thing because I think that we often we think we need to write with it. You know, we need to go down the timeline of what happened when, and especially in biography. I want to ask you a question in a second. See if I can get that in. And yet, if we only write in a strict linear way, we deny ourselves as the authors and we deny our readers the opportunity to actually experience a life in a way that a person might have experienced it. Because we're here together in this moment, but probably also memories are swirling around in our minds. Maybe we're also thinking about the future, what we're going to do tomorrow. And all of that exists right now for us. If I were to try to write the story of our time together and it went like this, I'd be missing so much of that dimensionality. So when I work on my historical projects, I always do create some kind of a timeline because I need those anchors. I need to know what happened when. But then I allow myself to move around in the timeline in a way that I hope or think, or that feedback might tell me, will best help me to convey the arguments that I'm feeling coming most strongly through the material, or to convey more of the essential aspect of the person's life. In all that she carried, for example, even though it's the story of a family of women, I don't start with the very first woman, because that very first woman lived a very long time ago, and I remember my agent told me, this is a little slow, that everybody wants to start off looking at Charleston in the 1600s. So I took that feedback and let it just sit in my mind, and then came up with an idea, which was not my idea consciously, it just arrived in the way that we talked about earlier. And I realized that, no, it really needed to start with a great-granddaughter. It needed to start with somebody who was much closer to our time, who had records and materials that I could make more real for us, and then circle back to the deeper past. So I thank you for that, and this gives me a chance to ask Caleb, I know that you said we don't have much time, but can you tell us about your biography that's coming out soon?
Sure. So I have a book coming out in August called Black Moses, A Saga of Ambition and the Fight for a Black State. And it really kind of focuses on the life, not just of a guy named Edward Preston McCabe, who wanted or tried to convince leaders throughout the United States and had convinced quite a few senators, US senators, to do the same, which was to kind of give the keys to Black people to what was then Oklahoma Territory, and had convinced thousands of Black people with the help of about 2,000 enlisted agents throughout primarily the US South, but also in parts of the North, to depart from the South and make their way to, of all places, Oklahoma Territory. And I think to your point of chronology, there was a world in which I could have written that book kind of very beat by beat, right? But I had to spend a lot of time, as I think Dr. Miles does in a lot of her books, thinking carefully about the question of inheritance. And in many ways, we don't come to a realization of what we inherit in a way that's hyper-sequential from the point at which we're born to the point at which we die. And so to some extent, I spend a lot of time in the book, in of all places, Haiti, where a lot of people tried in interesting ways to solve what McCabe had revolted at, which was this notion of the Negro problem. And so for McCabe to then decide, well, I have a solution to that Negro problem, I couldn't start in Troy, New York in 1820 when he was born, or 1850 rather, when he was born, right? I had to start in some weird ways and cut across different ways and identify what thematically would keep the reader engaged, as opposed to thinking that some sort of timeline, which in all senses would be relatively forced by me, that wouldn't have been reflective of the sort of experiences that he had and the sort of inheritance that he found himself contending with. So yeah, that's the book, and I think to your really great question about chronology is the kind of constant bugaboo that I think aggravates probably all of us the most, but probably is, and I'm not gonna look over there at a former editor, and what a lot of editors sometimes and agents really want, because it's perhaps arguably a little easier to sell. So yeah, I thought it was a phenomenal question.
And McCabe and Tubman have something in common, that they were both called Moses.
Yes.
The title of this book is Black Moses, which I think is the best title ever of the book coming out in August by Caleb.
Exeter Literary Festival 2026.
All right,
Yeah,
here we
course.
go.
I'll see you
go.
soon, right?
We have time for another question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm a student in PAA, and perhaps this is a more basic question, but I'm always curious as to how authors know, like, when their book is done, when to stop writing, when enough backstory is enough, basically, yeah.
If only there were an answer to that question that would be satisfying. I don't really feel that a book is ever done. It's hard to let the books go, and I'll tell you the truth. I mean, to me, it's like the deadline, right? If there's a deadline, the book's gonna have to be done, even if I feel like there was more that I could do or more that I wanted to discover. Actually, your question enables me to confess that this book was ready to go, and it was far along in the copy editing process. I mean, I think it was actually in page proofs. Yeah, When I went to a research library, I'm sure my dear editors were just like, oh my God, stop. I went to a library and was able to look at some materials that some incredible archivists put me onto, that they had a collection that they had just gotten a hold of. And oh my goodness, Harriet Tubman was in that collection, these little tiny mentions. And at least one of those mentions was something about Tubman that we hadn't known before. People had speculated and kind of wondered about when she had had a surgery on her brain. I didn't tell you all that she had severe headaches and seizures throughout her life after being hit by a very heavy weight, that an overseer had thrown. And later on in life, she had an operation to try to cure these terrible headaches, and nobody knew when this had happened. There was a letter in this collection where somebody wrote about Tubman walking into what's now Mass General in Boston in the 1870s and basically begging the doctors to help her with this terrible chronic pain. And so I wrote to my editors and I said, I know that you don't want to hear from me. I know you're probably going to hate me, but please, 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 can I get this into the book? And they very kindly allowed me to get this material into the electronic version of this edition, and then into the next printings. So they're never done.
Okay, thank you all so much. The books are for sale in the back. So go buy books and then go have them signed. Thank you all so much.